Hello everyone, welcome back to Conversations about Smite. This time I'll be talking about the most recent update, update 10.6 I believe it is. I've skipped over the skins section because that is a matter of personal taste, as well as the bug fixes, since, largely speaking, bug fixes aren't really going to change how one plays a particular character or whether or not one plays a particular character. There are rare exceptions to this, but generally speaking, that's not really what I'm interested in, because bug fixes are simply fixing the mistakes made by high-res. What I actually want to talk about are the bounce changes that are deliberate. It is 10.6, it says right there. Anyways, there's been a lot of changes with this update, a lot of new and exciting things that I do want to talk about. And we're going to just get right into it with soul surges. Now, I'm going to, quite honestly, summarize soul surges in case you haven't played since the new update, or you have played and you have no idea what the hell these are. Functionally speaking, what is happening is, after every, say, I believe it's 2 minutes currently, yes, there's a global, I believe it's a 2-minute cooldown if I'm remembering correctly, but every 2 minutes essentially, the first person who dies after every 2 minutes releases what is known as a soul surge. A soul surge does two very specific things. First, it is a large AoE, which very specifically increases the movement speed and causes a burn effect. Alright, you can see some of this right here as I'm reading about it, but it's easier to summarize it for you so you understand. So any god, regardless of side, in this area gets a move speed boost, and any god, again regardless of side, who is under half health, afflicts a burn effect that deals percentage of current HP, basically a miniature bluestone effect. Alright, this is for auto attacks and abilities. Finally, if you die in this area, your respawn timer is cut in half. Except in Conquest. Now, whether you like this or hate this is your personal decision. I'm going to talk about the second thing soul surges do in a second. I want to talk about the area effect. I like this overall, alright, for a small number of reasons. First, I'm going to take this into three specific things that the area buff does, the area effect does. Again, remember, it doesn't matter who dies first. It doesn't matter what side that initial victim is. Everyone gets these benefits. Okay? Now, why do I like this? Well, let's first talk about the movement speed. This makes getting the first kill in a team fight fairly rewarding. Alright? Because in the late game, when the first person falls, there are two responses that are possible, generally speaking, at least in late game team fights. The first is the side that lost the first person is going to aggro in the intention or hopes of either counteracting that death on their team by killing someone on the enemy team, thereby rebalancing the fight, or they will retreat to a tower, a phoenix, or possibly, in a last pinch effort, their titan. These are the two primary responses, the two predominant responses for very obvious reasons. An increase in movement speed makes the aggressive option a bit more viable. Why not the retreat option? Because guess who else is getting the increased movement speed? The enemy team that just got the first kill. They are also receiving an increase in movement speed. And retreating is not really going to change at all, to be completely and brutally honest. If you retreat, they're not going to chase you any harder because their movement speed boost is the same as yours and will expire at the same time. Alright? As soon as, will expire at the same time after they leave this circle. But if the team that lost the first person in the team fight aggroes, then they can use that movement speed to close that distance. The enemy team is probably going to be doing the same thing, so what this functionally is doing, is what I'm trying to say, is it is going to increase the success of, and therefore the likelihood of, aggressive team fighting after the first death. This is in fact why a lot of times you're going to see a lot of people dancing around before a team fight trying to get that poke and trying to not be the first one dead, because the first one dead is not going to be getting any benefit, and additionally, well, we'll get the additionally later on, but I like the increased movement speed. I do think that's going to make team fights more aggressive, which I think to a small extent was needed, and this is a nice little buff. It's only a 15% increase in movement speed, enough to make people a bit more aggressive, but not enough to, say, make fleeing unviable, right? So I do like this. The second one, I have a bit more problems with. I must confess I have mixed feelings about this one. Anyone below half health gets a miniature blue stone brooch effect. Okay? My problem with this is that this can really make team fights extremely expensive for even the winning team. It's going to be harder for, as long as this exists, for a team that wins a team fight to take a tower afterwards, to take a jungle objective, a jungle boss, right? It is going to be a little bit harder for the victorious team to roll a victorious team fight into a objective take. Furthermore, what's particularly interesting is that this particular buff, and this is the primary issue with this, I don't have a problem with the victorious team having a harder time taking objectives after the fact. I'm fine with this. My issue here is that this is very much going to skew in favor of builds that don't build as much power. Builds that emphasize HP. I'll come back to this point later on when we talk about item changes, because, quite honestly, there's some really eyebrow-raising item changes across the board that are going to affect this. And while I overall like this change, the Soul Surge edition, my issue is I think this wasn't a great time to institute it, considering the sweeping changes they have made to items this patch as well. I think they should have been done in separate updates. I think they've done too much in this update at one time, and I think taking it a little slower and moving a little bit more cautiously would have been a wiser strategy. Yes, I know they have the PTS, the public test server. I'm aware of that. However, that is a limited number of people going into that, and the people that go into the public test server tend to be the people more professionally interested in doing so. These are the content creators, the pro teams. These are the people who are generally more likely going to be going into a public test server and testing out these updates. Regular people, like probably most of you listening, aren't going to be looking to go into the public test server. You just want to sit down and play a good old-fashioned classic game of Smite, and you're not going to go onto the public test server, which is, incidentally, also a bit more unstable than their regular public servers. Anyways, leaving my criticisms of the public test servers as a check of this aside, back to the point, this is going to, first off, benefit builds that emphasize powerless. We're going to see hunters emphasize attack speed more, because this also affects attack speed, right? And they're, according to this and according to what I've seen, I don't see any kind of I don't see any kind of limit on how many of these burns you can have on you, so if the entirety of the enemy team is dogpiling you, and like 2 of them are at half health, you're going to be taking substantially more damage than you would expect, especially as a tank or a warrior, right, or a solo laner or a front, a support. So it's going to be harder for supports and solo laners to survive in team fights, or at least the early stages of the team fight, right? Obviously, this particular area does not last forever. It's right there. But it only lasts for 30 seconds in theory, but that 30 seconds can get a lot of people killed. Alright, especially since as more people die, that duration increases by 15 seconds. Eventually, it can go out to a maximum of 1.5 minutes, which is a fairly long time for a team fight. Let's be really honest here, at least late game team fights. But anyways, so we're going to have a very definite change in build strategy here. Again, hunters are going to be looking for more attack speed than they have before. Again, especially in view of item changes in the future. Again, I'll get to that. Mages are going to be looking a bit more into cooldown reduction than they have before. There was a bit of time where they really weren't hugely, they would build 10-20%, often 30, sure, but not everyone was building 30% cooldowns. Now it's going to be almost a requirement for 30% cooldown for ability-based. This is going to also, by the way, favor those who do use auto-attacks effectively, so you're going to see more of the auto-attack heavy mages, and even some mages who don't normally build auto-attack are going to start building auto-attack. Nuwa, for instance, is not normally associated as an auto-attack mage, but under this particular with the advent of soul surges, you're going to see some Nuwa players splash some more attack speed than they normally would to better take advantage of that burn effect on their auto-attacks, and her auto-attacks are decent enough as it is, right? I'll talk about that later on. But we are going to see that change. We are going to see tankier people, warriors, guardians, they're going to fall a little bit earlier in team fights than they normally would. Even if they don't die during the soul surge, you are going to see them take more damage than average in the soul surge. Alright, you're going to start to see any kind of god whose abilities all do damage is going to become a bit more prominent with the soul surges than they were before. So this second effect, while I do have... there's a variety of other things that are going to change with this, and it'll be really interesting to see how the player base adapts to this. You will see some of these changes. Again, attack speed is going to be more important. Cooldown is going to be more important. You're going to see gods with damaging abilities across the board. They're going to rise up in the meta a little bit, because if you inflict damage with an ability, you're going to be able to, slap on a burn effect. You're going to see Warlock's staff become a very popular item for mages, because it's going to increase their max HP, and you're going to see them really looking to capitalize on that. Ethereal staff, or E-staff as it's more frequently known, is going to become a more often purchased item by pretty much anyone that can buy it. It's useful for tanks, it's useful for mages. You're going to see that purchased substantially more often. Okay, you're going to see all these kinds of changes. We're going to go back to a meta where supports and solo laners are going to be emphasizing HP more. Again, especially in view of some of the later item changes. Finally, the dying inside the soul surge reduces your respawn timer by 50%. I actually don't have a problem with this. I would actually have preferred this to also affect Conquest, because this then creates a really interesting emphasis on the soul surge beyond the second effect, which is already substantial enough, but this really creates a fascinating interplay with the movement speed. Alright, so this soul surge happens, and if we die inside the soul surge, we come back twice as quickly as we would normally. Our death cooldowns are cut in half, so we want to fight in this, and we get increased movement speed in this, but then if we're losing the fight, we can retreat. Will the enemy chase us? Can we turn this fight around outside of the soul surge? We have this whole question. This is why overall, even with the burn effect included, which I think probably should be adjusted to be a bit more fair to gods that don't have specific circumstances, but anyways, that's something we'll see whether or not that is a hard effect for the rest of the year. But anyways, even with the burn effect, I think Soul Surges are going to create a really interesting strategic dynamic to team fights in Smite, and I like to see that. Team fights without this are fairly predictable, in all honesty. But with the Soul Surge kicking around, we have this really fascinating new area where we'll want to fight in it or not fight in it. You know, if we're losing a team fight, do we want to retreat using the increased movement speed? Yes, the enemy team will also be getting that, but do we want to retreat? Or do we want to stay in the Soul Surge and try to take advantage of the burn? Do we try to die in the Soul Surge so we come back a little faster? You know, do we throw the team fight in order to come back earlier? Or, you know, throw the team fight so we die in the Soul Surge before it fades? Or do we try to hold the line somewhere else? We have all these interesting questions that are going to come up in the middle of a team fight right then and there, and I think that's a great thing. Alright, the second effect of the Soul Surge is, of course, spawning these, what I want to call Ghost Harpies. Or actually, they look more like Ghost Oracles, to be honest, so I'll call them Ghost Oracles. These are a great source of golden experience. What's really interesting, though, is that they provide magic power. They provide some healing that's not really that big of a deal, right? The more interesting thing is that they provide stats, which I'm assuming to be temporary stats, since making that permanent stats could cause long-term problems. In my experience, it isn't permanent stats, by the way. I have played some matches with this. I have tested this. This is not permanent stats. They don't make that clear here, unfortunately. But yeah, this is not permanent stats. This is temporary stats. Still pretty nice. This is a great reason to stay in the Soul Surge. It does incentivize that, because if you leave the Soul Surge, you're not going to be able to potentially get the golden experience and the temporary stat boosts of the Soul Surge spirits, the Ghost Oracles. I do like the nerf to the shutdown reward, because it makes getting really ahead a bit more, I won't say a bit more rewarding, it makes it less risky, right? It will decrease people's likelihood of running away when they're in danger of dying after 5 kills or whatever. And I think that's a good thing. Alright, I'm not going to talk about the ranked reset. I don't care. The assault changes, not really a big deal. It's very mild changes. We, of course, have the visual change to Conquest. Not going to talk about that. That's just visual. What I do want to talk about is the really interesting changes to Conquest in terms of its geometry. The mid lane is now wider and closer to solo. The width of mid lane isn't the thing that I want to talk about. That doesn't matter. Not really. It matters to junglers. It is going to be a bit more cramped in the jungle, theoretically speaking. I'm going to talk about more of these. You know what? Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk about the Conquest changes here. I'm going to make a separate video for that. Okay? Not even going to talk about that. That will be its own video. So we're going to temporarily skip Conquest, because I want to talk about that in its own video. Let's go to the items. I want to talk about the glyphs first, primarily because they're here, secondarily because they aren't a huge change. Although I am glad to see the Relic Dagger getting glyphs, because quite honestly, the Relic Dagger had extremely limited use cases, and even then, those use cases were for very specific gods. Alright, some people were fond of building it for a little bit of extra health and cooldown reduction, and their particular strategy relied on their relics, and so they really wanted their relics to be available as often as possible. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a wrong way to play. That is a perfectly acceptable way of playing, but Relic Dagger even on that basis, rarely offered enough incentive for it to become a regular item unless you were going for a specific strategy on specific gods. But with the glyphs, we now actually have some use cases, alright? Mostly the Bewitched Dagger, which is, of the two glyphs here, my favorite. All enemy gods have 25% reduced attack speed in a 55-unit radius around you. Now, this is really fascinating, because this is, functionally, Witchblade, which I've sorely missed as a support main since its disappearance. I loved Witchblade. Incredibly useful item. And Relic Dagger with the Bewitched Dagger glyph is functionally just Witchblade with Relic Dagger's passive on top. That's literally all it is. I think this is great, especially since, noticeably, with the increase in basic attack damage of hunters, it's been a bit tougher for supports to survive a hunter. Yes, it is part of the hunter's job to kill the support. The problem is that it's been a little too easy for that to happen, and the Bewitched Dagger is going to offer at least another option for supports to counteract that. Okay? So I really like this. The Eldritch Dagger, I'm not as excited about. When you activate a relic, your protections are increased by 15%. You gain the ability to see wards for 10 seconds. Seeing wards for 10 seconds really isn't that big of a deal. It's just buy a sentry ward. Quite honestly, that's not really big. The protection increase by 15% would be more exciting if they didn't just sweepingly reduce protections across the board here, which I'll talk about in detail in a bit, but I'm not as excited about the Eldritch Dagger. Runeforged Hammer got some glyphs, which I'm not against, but it's not the first item I would have picked for this. Runeforged Hammer was a fairly good item on specific gods, specific warriors at least, and even a handful of non-warriors, right? But let's talk about these glyphs. So, the first glyph, the Flameforged Hammer, that burns the enemies based on your protections, there are going to be some warriors that are going to really love this, namely the warriors that boost their own protections. Guan Yu is going to not be able to use this, for instance, because his only real hard CC is from his ult, which is, of course, not going to be up all the time. And that's the only thing that's going to trigger Runeforged Hammer. But there are going to be some warriors that will absolutely have a grand time with this. For instance, you could very easily see Gilgamesh with his ult absolutely dominate with this. Alright? And that's going to be a very scary thing. I think this is a really precarious item, and I think this is going to need some adjustment. There are going to be some warriors with sufficiently large amounts of hard crowd control that are going to really be difficult to deal with Flameforged Hammer, that won't be able to be replicated on their competitors because, lo and behold, they don't have enough hard crowd control. Okay? This is also going to increase the number of warriors we're going to see, and even some non-warriors, any hunter or generally any physical god with enough hard crowd control is going to become quite the interesting threat here. We're going to be seeing a lot more people splash protections. Again, power isn't as big of a deal as it used to be. And there are some people that can really make this unpleasant to deal with. So I think that Flameforged Hammer will need to be changed. I think this is going to massively change how people approach warriors. I think Flameforged Hammer is a little bit more aggressive. Yes, it sounds like a really not big of a deal, right? We have 5 plus 10% of your protections from items and abilities as magic damage every 1 second while inside the rune. Alright? Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, 200 protections on a solo laner, right? So we're looking at 20 damage. That's 25 damage per second while the enemy is inside the rune. Keep in mind that the rune itself is increasing damage taken by those enemies by 10%. So we're actually talking about, and I'm going to round up here, 28 damage, right? With hard CC, 5 seconds. So we are looking at, over the course of a rune, a fairly decent, let's just go on ahead and summarize, 150 HP. Which is fine, right? By itself. Add in Mystical Mail. Constant magic damage over time. The damage that the warrior is already going to be doing. Throw in, say, Bluestone Pendant. More damage over time. You can see where I'm going with this. By itself on paper, this is fine. Right? It's low damage. It's going to, for the average warrior, it's going to run somewhere between 20 and 30 damage per second, typically. Right? Even if you're only running 150, you're still looking at 150 of each protection. You're still looking at, well, I actually separated out the protections there. It's actually a little bit more. If you're running 200 of each protection, that's 20 plus 20, 40, 45. So you're actually going to be running, logically speaking, you're going to be doing between 30 and 50 damage per second. Again, run that out to 5 seconds, because hard CC is typically going to allow you to keep people in that rune for the full 5 seconds, and you're looking at a fairly interesting time of 250, we're going to be generous here, 200 to 300 damage per rune, which can re-trigger every 15 seconds. Again, throw in Mystical Mail, we're doing damage every second on top of that. Throw in Bluestone Pendant, which is doing damage for the next 2 to 4 seconds. It's 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds per ability, 2 stack max. Bluestone Brooch is going to make that a percentage of your current health based on your ability damage. This is going to get a little bit out of control. And I think either this is going to have to change, or they're going to have to change Mystical Mail, or they're going to have to change Bluestone. Now, obviously, they're not likely to change Mystical Mail or Bluestone. I think this is going to have to change. I think a great change, just off the top of my head, would be a protection reduction, which would additionally incentivize the solo laner into, in the late game at least, working more with their allies. It can also be very rewarding for a solo laner to take on somebody alone, because you're reducing their protections, obviously, especially if it reduces both protections, physical and magical, in which case a solo laner could really get a lot out of it. If we changed this, and this is just a suggestion that I expect might be, this is a suggestion for future, because again, I think this is going to get a little out of control when combined with other effects properly, but in future, if this were to change, I would prefer this to change to reducing enemy protections by 5 plus 1 for the level of the wielder. So this would eventually be starting at 5, going up to 25. Yes, we already have Stone of Binding for that. I understand that. However, we'll talk about Stone of Binding in a bit. We're going to leave that one alone for now. Rune-Breaking Hammer, I can see being quite useful, but that's not going to occur to a lot of people right off the top. But I talk quite often about the enemy team composition being more damaging or more defensive or tankier. Rune-Breaking Hammer is going to be really great against enemy team compositions with too little frontline. We're talking, say, a team composition with 3 mages, a hunter, and a guardian, for instance. They have a solo lane mage. Well, it'll be a little easier to punish that with Rune-Breaking Hammer, because as long as they are inside of that glyph, or actually your next successful hard CC, you're going to shockwave them, and they're going to be dealing 10% less damage, right? So I think Rune-Breaking Hammer is going to be a really nice option, but Flame-Forged Hammer, I think, when combined with other damage over time effects, is going to get very out of control with specific warriors. With the right, not even warriors, I'm going to be really brutally honest, anyone with enough hard CC can really make that a problem. Alright, mark my words. People will break this. I'm going to give it maximum 2 weeks. I can probably break this. I've got a couple of ideas in mind that I'm going to run some experiments on, but Flame-Forged Hammer concerns me. Pridwin, great, gets glyphs. Fantastic. I like Pridwin by itself, but getting glyphs is a really nice option. The first glyph is essentially 2 weaker explosions. Second option is, quite frankly, a more emphasis on the shield and less damage, right? You get a larger shield, but you explode for less damage. The first one is you explode twice, but your shield is smaller. It's going to be a matter of how aggressive you're feeling. I like this. It gives you a choice between, well, do I want to inflict more damage, or do I want to be tankier, right? And that's going to depend upon a combination of your strategy and who you're playing as. For example, Reverent Pridwin is going to make dealing with Geb an unholy nightmare, as an example. That's going to get gross. Just as an example. Now, I do want to point out, before I move on to the game-wide item stat reductions, I do want to point out that I would like, in future, for you to be permitted 2 glyphs. We're seeing more and more items get glyphs, and I suspect, what I personally think is going to happen is that Hi-Rez is gearing up for all items to have glyph options, which I'm fine with. I think that's a great idea. I think it's going to add some customizable build items here. We're going to get more exciting builds. We're going to have less standardized builds, so to speak, and I think that's a great thing. More customization, more personal builds, I'm totally down with. But in order to better emphasize that, I do think we need the ability in the near future, hopefully next year, to have 2 glyphs. When more items, of course, have glyph options, it would be nice to just have 2 items be glyphed, and then, run the rest as normal. Just a side thought. Now, the game-wide stat reductions on items. This is what I've been referring to for quite some time. Almost every item in the game is having a decrease in power and health and protections. Alright? This is interesting because it is going to make games a little slower, which is very odd because, well, I'm going to tackle this from the point of their goals first. Alright, I'm actually going to take from the game-wide item stat reduction changes. I'm going to go from their goals up, alright, because they are at least explaining why they're doing this. Empower tanks and tanky builds by nerfing HP and protections less than power. Fair point. I have noticed, and I have talked about, tanks dying a little too quickly. Given the Spirit Surge edition, I think this is self-defeating, okay? Which is one of my problems with the burn effect on Spirit Surge that I was referring to earlier. I will say I don't have a problem with the decrease in the protections by itself. In the past half year, it has been incredibly easy for myself and many full tank builds to easily overcap on their protections. And I can still do it even with these protection nerfs. I've run tests. It's still pretty damn easy to overcap on both protections, for Pete's sakes. Alright? Very easy to do. Which, it should still be possible to do. I think protections, right now as they are fine. I like the nerf on protections. I disagree with the nerf to health because, quite honestly, what Hi-Rez may not necessarily have considered, they may have, they may not have, they don't mention it here, so I don't know if they've considered this, but it is worth pointing out, decreasing the health increases on items also means certain gods, but more specifically, certain items are going to be substantially less effective, and it's going to give Arachne quite the nifty buff, because, fun fact, Arachne is secretly broken in Conquest. I'll one day do a video about that, but her passive is grotesque. For every, I think it's 2% of an enemy's HP that is missing compared to their max health, she gets a buff in her power. Decreasing the amount of health supports and tanks in general are going to be getting from items is going to make her hit those goals on those targets so much faster. Arachne, who already is insanely scary if used correctly, even scarier. This is also going to make, again, such... Thanatos is going to get scarier. Achilles is going to get scarier. Ao Kuang is going to get scarier. Because it's going to take less time for them to get you to the health threshold that ends you. Anybody with an execution is going to be a bit more powerful because of this. Because of the nerf to health increases in items. Again, just for emphasis, the reduction of protections I'm fine with. That needed to happen. It was too easy maxing out your protections. I'm totally fine with this. The decrease to health, that affects those gods, that affects Jinsai's, it affects Heartseeker. Okay? It does mitigate the severity of the burn damage that's going to be affected, that is going to be affecting you. That is true, but it also means that you're going to hit that burn a little bit earlier than you normally would. And you might be thinking, well, 15% decrease in health isn't really that big of a deal, but remember, health increases on items are in the hundreds. Okay, we're talking, say an item increases your health prior to this by 300, you're looking at a really substantial 60 HP reduction. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're building, say, 3 items that increase health, they all use to increase your health by 300, and now these are all giving you 60 less HP, for instance, in this mathematical theory. Now you're losing a mean 240 HP. Hell, even with 2 items, say for instance, you buy one item, it used to give you 300 HP, and a second item, it used to give you 200 HP. That's a 500 HP total increase on 2 items. Great. Fantastic. You are losing, quite honestly, 75 total HP under this. That's almost a full item. It's almost an 100 HP increase. Alright? Quite frankly, that's about half an HP increase, half an item's HP increase by itself. In 2 items. Again, I'm not fond of the health change. I like the protections, not fond of the health. The power change, I would be fine with, except for their change to penetration. I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but I want to point out that they've brought percentage penetration back to where it was before. Alright? On paper, not really a big deal, but a decrease to power and an increase to penetration isn't really going to be that significant of a difference. There is going to be some mild differences. Quite frankly, those differences are going to primarily affect fights between squishier people. This is going to affect primarily fights between mages, fights between hunters, fights between assassins. These fights you will see the change in. Those fights are going to be more drawn out. Those fights are going to be more dramatic and more interesting to see. You're going to see those changes there. You are not going to see these changes drastically affect how one approaches a warrior or a guardian, because the penetration has been brought back to where it was before. In other words, it's back to full percentages and divisible by 10. And your power didn't matter as much to killing a tankier target as your penetration did. So you're not going to see this change how people approach tanks. It really doesn't empower tanks at all. Tanks remain the same. If you are a support main and you're listening to this, your builds really aren't going to change that much. You might go for an item more for its passive than its protections now, but you're really not going to be making too much of a drastic change in how you approach fights, how you build. None of that's really going to change substantially. Again, you'll mildly emphasize an item's passive more than you would its stats. But outside of that, you're really not seeing changes. Decreased burstiness of DPS versus DPS combat, as I just mentioned, with the changes in power and how that's going to affect how these damage people fight each other, absolutely. That one, they absolutely nailed. I completely agree with them on that one. Nailed that on the head. DPS v DPS combat absolutely is going to be longer. I think that's a good thing. Alright? And I think that's wonderful. This is going to make gods such as Awilish less scary. Okay? And I think that's a good thing. I like that. Make power and protection caps harder to reach and more meaningful to reach. Power, yes. Protection, no. I can still full cap both protections with only slightly more trouble. Not really that big of a deal here. I think they hit their goal here on the power. I don't think they hit it on the protections. Alright? If they wanted to hit it on the protections, it would have had to have been a 20% reduction in protections. Just being really honest. Changes the feel of the power curve, especially in the mid to late game. Yeah, a little bit. I can agree with that. I don't know how intensely they wanted to change the feel of the power curve, so I can't tell you if they hit that goal or not. I have no idea what they were expecting on that. They don't state it here. But has the feel of the power curve changed? Yes. If that was their minimum, they've hit that. Now, I'm not going to go item by item here because all power and all protections, basically all of the power and protection health stats, they've all changed across the board, so it's really not going... I'm not going to talk about those, alright? Not even the change in thresholds, as they stated, they have actually changed that. Decreased item passives that provide power, health, or protection by a similar amount, right? They actually mentioned that the max magical power gain here, they've already mentioned that, right? That's fine. Don't really have a problem with that. I'm not going to talk about these too much. See, we've lost a third of Berserker Shield's health, which is what I was talking about earlier. Alright. Decrease the percentage on this. That's fine. Don't really have a problem with that. I don't have a broad problem. You can see that these have only been decreased by like 10. It's still very easy to hit those caps. Alright. This right here is something I'm going to talk about. Obviously, we have a decrease in protections. I'm not going to really talk about that. We've already talked about that broadly. Decreased movement speed on Breastplate of Regrowth. I can understand why they made this change. They talk about it very specifically in the context of... Oh, it's, you know, with the 30% move speed buff, it's too hard to kill healers. That's not my problem with healers with Breastplate of Regrowth. The scariest thing about a healer with Breastplate of Regrowth is that they can keep up with you and then finish murdering you. Alright? Let's not beat around the bush. Yes, it is more difficult catching up to a healer with Breastplate of Regrowth. Yes, it's much harder to kill them. And that is a huge problem. And they are correct in doing this. I like this nerf to Regrowth. I have no issues with it. But they are completely ignoring the equally scary problem of, here's the enemy healer. I'm in danger. and I can't run. Because all they have to do is blast their heal, and I'm boned. Because I am not going to be able to run away from them. Personally, while I do like the movement speed percentage decrease, I don't think it's enough. I would personally prefer that the passive trigger every 15 seconds rather than the 10 I believe it currently is, if my memory serves correctly. I think that nerf will need to be made at some point in the near future. I don't think a mere 10% reduction... Actually, it's a 33% reduction, but I don't think a mere reduction in the move speed buff here is enough. I don't think that's a big enough change to stop this from being a grotesquely scary item. Caduceus Club, similar idea here. Alright, very similar idea. Don't really have a problem with that. The rest of these are changes we've already talked about. Not really a problem. Nothing particularly new here. Decrease in attack speed is fairly interesting on Demon Blade, but that's fine. Nothing particularly standout here. A slight nerf to Emperor's Armor, which is good. Okay. I do like this. I think it was a little too strong. I like the 30%. It feels good to me. I tested this out already in Assault, actually, which is where I like to do some testing for some really unpredictable scenarios. I do like these changes. I do think this is a good change here. All right. I think this is nice where it is. That aside, we talk about some other things. I do like that they reduced the number of stacks here. Alright. On this. The interesting thing with Gauntlet of Thebes that not a lot of people talk about is they outline it right here, obviously, but the number of protections you get from Gauntlet of Thebes is 1-to-1 with its stacks. That's always been the case. I don't mind this, right? I don't have a really big problem with that. Again, we lost another 50 health there, of course. Again, a lot of these we knew were coming. They decreased the aura here, of course. Again, not really a huge deal. Makes aura botting a little bit more difficult, but that's not really that big of a deal. All these other things that we know of. Mail of Renewal got nerfed. It was already ass in the first place. I don't really care. Nothing particularly notable. Again, I've already talked about these broadly. We've already talked about Pridwin. They did change. This is a good change, alright? I alluded to this with the glyphs, because the glyphs actually have the changed language already, but they're just kind of reiterating it here. Previous to this, Pridwin's initial shield was based off of your protections, and the explosion was based off the shield health, achieving theoretically the same effect. But now that they've added glyphs to Pridwin, it's better to scale it off of protections for a more streamlined math, basically. Alright, it doesn't really change. This is neither a nerf nor is it a buff. It's roughly the same effect. It's just better math for the system to use, functionally. I like this because Prophetic Cloak is a little bit OP to the point where it was like almost a required item on every build. As a result, we have a aura of 20. Totally fine with that. Not really any issues there. I do have a problem with the nerfing of this. Right, decreased passive scaling threshold from 3% at 2,000 to 1.5% at 2,250. I would have preferred that they not reduce the percentage here. It should have been kept at 3%, but it should have been at 2,500 health. Alright, because this itself isn't really that big of a deal, right? It should have been... The problem is that most people are going to hit this by accident automatically. As I mentioned earlier, chin size is already received a indirect nerf by reducing the amount of health people are getting from protection items or items in general. So chin size already had an indirect nerf in the first place, and I don't like that they nerfed it at the same time here. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I think they changed too much in this one update. I would have preferred either the sweeping item changes or the Spirit Surge. I think doing both at the same time is a little bit extreme, and while that doesn't affect chin size specifically, again, the Spirit Surge is going to emphasize health, because if you're under half health, you're going to get that burn. So the more health you have, the earlier you get that burn. That burn effect, I should say. But I will say I dislike the essentially double nerf to chin size. I think it's a little too much all at once, personally. I agree that it was doing too much to squish your targets, but rather than changing both the percentage and the health cap, it just really stretched the health cap. Alright, 2,500, 2,750, somewhere along there. Alright, I think a 1.5% at 2250 health, I don't think that's enough to not have this hurt squish your targets. And additionally, as I mentioned earlier, it's already received the nerf indirectly from the change in how health is provided, so I just don't like that double nerf, and I think it's a little too much. I would like to... I kind of expect to see this particular passive be mildly buffed in the future as a result. I think we're going to see some problems with chin size in the long run. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm a pessimist, so leave that where it is. Rage I'm fine with. Don't really have any issues with any of these. Passive scaling power change, desperately needed. Alright, 20% was too much. This hit way too hard when someone was under half health, especially in view of the Spirit Surge. Egads. That could really nullify the benefit of Spirit Surge. The Spirit Surge burn. You fall under half health and you get your burn effect, but then this mage with Tahuti just sweeps in and blasts you into next week. Yeah, no, not a cool thing. So I can understand this. I like this in view of the Spirit Surge. If the Spirit Surge wasn't added, maybe I would have had a bit more questions, but I'm fine with this the way it is. Now with the Spirit Surge, that's totally fine. I do like this. Silver Branch Bow is too difficult to stack with the overcap on the attack speed, and quite frankly, you wouldn't necessarily get to the 100 stacks anyways. I'm fine with this. I think this should be 25 personally, but minor quibble, and I think probably in the future they will change it to 25. Did the same thing here for chin size. I have the same issue, although at least the change from 2% to 1% is a little bit more reasonable, but same issue, just not as severe. Alright. I dislike this. Alright. We're going from 20 to quite literally 16, which is, besides my problem with that being a really odd number to run, it's not a huge enough difference if they're trying to prevent this from curb stomping squish your targets. Either... And they keep adjusting this downwards, and it's just not enough. What they really need to do is either cut Stone of Binding or bring in hybrid items. Bring in items with just a little bit of defense, a little bit of protections. Bring items like that back. Or drop Stone of Binding entirely. This isn't significant enough. Even with this is ending at 16 reduction of protections, both protections, at level 20. That's still a huge chunk of a squishy's protections. Okay, it's only a difference of 4. Yes, at the lower numbers of protections, that is a bit more of a difference than at the higher numbers. But it's still not that big of a deal. It really isn't. It's just my problem with it isn't that it's wrong, it's just meaningless. It's not significant enough. This will just help with Transcendence's dominance in the field. People still buy it, obviously, particularly more ability-based hunters like Marty or Medusa. I'm fine with this, right? Warlock Staff is... Okay, look. They have killed the need to build Warlock Staff. I mentioned earlier that Warlock Staff is going to get more popular. Warlock Staff has always been more popular than it deserved, which is why I said that. Warlock Staff has never been worth your attention. And with these nerfs, it still isn't. Look, 200 health. Even with the health nerfs on the every other health item in the game, you're still getting more health or equal amounts of health from everything else. Don't build Warlock Staff. Bully Staff. Mini rant over. Don't really have a problem with Sentinel's Embrace. I think it was a little too strong. It's fine. I wish they nerfed Boomba's Hammer's passive a little bit, but that's fine. The true damage, I think, is at 80. I think it'll be interesting to see. My problem with... The reason why I wanted Boomba's Hammer's passive to change is actually specifically in respect to the across-the-board nerf to all of their stats. Boomba's Hammer is going to become a bit scarier now because we're getting less health out of things, so tanks will be less able to absorb that 80 true damage over, I think it's, what, 5 seconds? Not over 5 seconds, but it refreshes every 5 seconds if I remember off the top of my head. My numbers might be wrong on that, right at the top of my head, but anyways... Boomba's Hammer's passive is going to get a little bit scarier in context of these other nerfs, and I really wish they would have given that a mild nerf. Bring it down to 70 true damage, 60 true damage, 50 true damage, something like that, or make the cooldown a little bit longer, maybe make it add an extra 3-5 seconds on that. Boomba's Hammer is going to become a little bit more unmanageable as a result of this, just due in relation to the other changes. Again, we're getting less health out of items, we're getting less protections out of items. Yes, it's still pretty easy to full cap your protections, but not everyone's trying to. Solo laners. I haven't talked about this before, but solo laners are really going to feel the protection nerfs. Supports aren't. Again, if you're a support main, you're not going to really change your build that much. But if you're a solo main, you are going to have to completely reapproach how you build. I will be making a video on that after I talk about Conquest in general and the changes to Conquest, but I am going to very specifically be talking about solo laners because the protection nerfs really affect them. The power nerfs really affect them. It's going to be a lot more difficult to make a good build as a solo laner unless you're using very specific gods. We're going to see a big shakeup in this solo lane world. Alright? And I think as a result of this, I think we're going to see warriors used even less in solo lane. I'm not sure about that because that really depends on how the players react en masse to these changes. But I wouldn't be surprised to see warriors become even less frequently used in solo lane than before. If you're a solo main, this is going to be a great time to experiment with someone new. Okay? Fantastic time. Experiment with someone who isn't a warrior. This is going to be a great time for that. But that's also, again, going to depend on how the player base at large handles these changes. But, yeah, solo laners are going to hate Boomba's Hammer in the late game. The rest of these are, again, fairly standard across the board nerfs. We have a bit of a protection buff decrease from Protector of the Jungle, which is great. It needed to happen. Junglers were getting too tanky with that. Totally fine with this. And I think that's the only really big changes on individual items. These items aren't performing well, got buffed. Yep. 10% mana heal on hit of the passive. I think that's a great thing. Okay. Passive CC immunity. Great thing. I like those. It gives you a reason to build Absolution. You really never had a reason to build Absolution. Functionally, if you didn't know what Absolution did, it gave allies around you a CC immunity for 0.6 seconds before when you threw your ultimate. Right? I believe it was your ultimate. I build it so rarely I've forgotten if it's your ultimate or if it's hitting, or if it's when you receive crowd control. Let me double check this really quick. It sucked ass, which is why I never bought it in the first place. Yeah, when your ultimate is finished casting, it was the ultimate. I did remember. Look at me. So proud of me. Anytime you used your ults, you used to just blast out a shockwave that gave all allies within the shockwave 0.6 seconds of CC immunity. And if it sounds like it was useless, it's because it was, which is why nobody purchased it. The 1 second CC immunity, still not that big of a deal, but the mana heal, that's tasty. The passive CC immunity is barely better. Better, but not by much. Still no one's going to buy it for the CC immunity, except in hyper rare situations. But that mana heal, that's a different story. That could be nice. I'll have to experiment with that a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be game-changing, but it actually does give you a reason to purchase the item now. Just buffed Abyssal Stone's debuff there, that's fine. Changed Amulet of Silence, which is fine. Amulet of Silence was only... I don't think this is going to be really making a big difference on whether or not people grab Amulet of Silence, because, quite honestly, look, alright, I'm going to be really brutally honest. The reason why people don't generally buy Amulet of Silence is not because the passive is bad. That is not why. Functionally, what happens with Amulet of Silence is... Alright, Heartward Amulet you already want to buy against magic-heavy comps, right? Not at all a problem. Very understandable. When you buy Heartward Amulet, you have a choice of two glyphs. One is the Amulet of the Stronghold. 15% of your physical protections... let me phrase it better. Your magic protections go up by 15% of your physical protections. Lovely. Against a magic-heavy comp, that is a lovely thing to have. Everyone loves it, everyone wants it. Your other option is Amulet of Silence. Amulet of Silence is, every time someone casts an ability near you, you get a stack. At 5 stacks, your next auto attack silences the enemy for... I think it was 1.5 seconds, if I'm remembering correctly. I rarely build it, so I'm not 100% on that one. And all they've done here is make that every 4 abilities and make it happen every 15 seconds. I'm going to be really honest with you. I'd still rather have the magic protections, because at the end of the day, that's going to be more reliable. Okay? Silencing an enemy for 1 to 2 seconds, in most cases, rarely matters. There are some situations it does, but between the choice of potentially silencing an enemy for a short duration or just getting more magic protections, I'm going to take the more magic protections, especially in consideration of the fact that protections have been nerfed. So yeah, I'm going to go for the protections. The problem with Amulet of Silence is, compared to the beauty of Amulet of the Stronghold, Amulet of Silence cannot and will never compare. Because at the end of the day, Amulet of Silence is going to be unreliable. You can miss the auto attack. For instance, you could be in the middle of a 1v1 and trying to survive, and that is going to stack slower. You are also going to have situations in which you'll have the stacks, but before you can pull off your auto attack to silence somebody, the rest of the enemy team all also cast items, and you've just missed out on 2, possibly 3 silences all in one go in the middle of a team fight. It's just so hideously unreliable. Alright? Compared to the constancy of Amulet of the Stronghold. It's very basic. It's not even about the effects. The effect of Amulet of Silence by itself isn't bad. It's a nice effect. It just isn't constant like Amulet of the Stronghold is. And pretty much everyone, when push comes to shove, wants the constancy over the unreliability. It's just basic strategy. Right? I dislike this buff on Cyclopean Ring. I think this is a bad thing. We've already had powerful Cyclopean Ring. It was ugly. This isn't good. Yes, it got a mild magic power decrease, but any mage that's going to be building Cyclopean Ring isn't building Cyclopean Ring for its magic power. Okay, this magic power decrease does not matter to how useful Cyclopean Ring is. Increasing the max health damage on this is a dangerous step in the wrong direction. Alright. Dawnbringer. I like this. Basically, people near you. I believe that's the effect. I think I'm confusing this with another effect. Hold on. Let me double check this. Yeah. This is very much, this is about the radius. You get up to 30% protections and movement speed when 3 enemy gods are in the area. I'm fine with that. I really am. That's fine. The internal cooldown of Frostbound Hammer and Gem of Isolation has been reduced. That's fine. I don't think it's strong enough because, quite frankly, 8 seconds is still too long of a period of time for that passive to be even useful. I think this should be either, at the most, this should be 7 seconds, primarily because, at the very least, you can blast out the passive of this effect, and then throw your abilities, and then your opponent will have 3 to 8 seconds, depending on what character you are, to get out of dodge if they want to retreat, and I think 7 seconds is a little bit of a stronger buff on this. I don't think that this is a big enough change. Maybe it is. We'll see. I just don't think so on paper. Hastened Ring, again, no one's building this for the power, so reducing its cost, I mean, it probably needed a cost reduction anyways. It was very expensive, but Jotun's Vigor getting a buff on its triggers, I like this. I think this is great, especially, again, in context of the Spirit Surge. Well, this specifically, the HP threshold being 50%, I do like. I like that. 40% was too little. You were too low on health. Remember, this is for primarily damage dealers. So, yeah, 40% was a fairly low amount of HP for damage dealers. 50% is more reasonable. I like that. The duration of 8 seconds, I like. I'm curious to see if that's too long or still too short. I'm very curious to see. It'll be interesting to watch that. I like the buff to Manticore Spikes. Passive damage increased to 4%. The reason why is because, again, we're getting less health out of items, so buffing this slightly is pretty important for it to maintain. So this isn't a buff, this is a maintenance, to be brutally honest. I do like that. I like that the passive duration on the Guardian Mail has increased. You are relying on the enemy to shoot you, so when they do, getting some good benefits out of this is important. I do like this. Not sure about the 4 stacks. It'll be interesting to see if that's too strong, but I do like the increased passive duration. I like the mild buff to Stone of Gaia. Again, we are seeing lower amounts of health from our items, so getting a slightly higher amount of healing is a good thing. Again, this is for maintaining its effectiveness more than an actual buff. That is fine. I think that increasing moves and attack speed on Talisman of Energy is dangerous here. Again, given Spirit Surge, I understand that we are reducing the stacks here. But I think 3% is too strong. I would have preferred 2.5. get a nice, clean, even 10%. Right now, we're looking at 12%, right? It's still down from the original. It's not even down. It's the same amount as just faster stacks. I think this is dangerous. I don't mind the decreased stacks, but I think maintaining this is a little bit dangerous in view of Spirit Surge. This should have been very mildly nerfed. Again, decrease the number of stacks, increase the movement and attack speed only slightly. I think 2.5 would have been a bit of a better one. I think 12%, going to be a little bit too strong. I think 10% would have been more reasonable. It's more in line with the other percentage increases that we see in other items. A lot of the other items are increasing things by 10% or decreasing things by 10%, and I think a 12% increase is just a little too strong for increasing both move and attack speed. Personally, I think this might need a mild nerf in the future in context of Spirit Surges. I do like the buff to Telkines. I still think this is going to be too weak. I still think that this should, at least to some extent, scale off of magic power damage. To at least a little bit. I liked the 10% scaling on that, personally. That's just me. They've just changed the thresholds of these in view of the changes to other things. Not really a big deal here, right? I think this is a massive extreme change here on Heartseeker, though. I will say, I think 250 to 100 would have been a better thing. Scale it more gradually. I think my big problem with Heartseeker is that it's only a 50 power difference here, right? Make it a 100 power difference. Make it scale more gradually. Personal opinion. Lana's Mask, they should have treated with a bit more specific caution, because the downsides of having not enough protections for Lana's Mask hurt you. Alright, I want to test this, but I think Lana's Mask might have suffered too much to be a viable item at this point. I want to test this personally, so I'm going to just say that I suspect we're going to have a problem with this. With Lana's Mask specifically. I'm going to test that, though. Because, functionally, look. Lana's Mask, if you don't hit those thresholds, unless I'm thinking of the evolution. I know the evolution does. I don't remember what the evolution is called. It would help if I could... There we go. Yes, it is the evolution. I was correct. Yes. So, when you don't have enough protections, this thing decreases the damage you deal. Across the board. Alright? And you already don't do that much damage as a support anyways. So it's not that big of a deal. But, in view of the fact that whether or not you do normal damage or not depends on your protections, and protections across the board have been nerfed, it would have... Personally, I would have found it very important to make sure Lana's Mask scaled appropriately as well. But there is no mention here of a decrease in the threshold amounts of not getting your damage reduced. So I fear that Lana's Mask is going to be too much of a pain in the neck to not have your damage reduced. That is my problem here. The predecessor, by the way, is Protector's Mask. I was thinking of the correct mask when I made my initial statements. Lana's Mask is the evolution. I was absolutely correct on that. But I think that Lana's Mask is dead. Dead in the water. Because the only people who can buy Lana's Mask are non-Guardian supports. And they're going to have, again, a lower baseline protections, and the items are not giving them as many protections as they used to. I don't think this is going to be used at all anymore. For that reason, Lana's Mask will need another change before that becomes functionally useful again, in my opinion. The nuts all change the same. These are miscellaneous changes. I like this. Change here. I think it was a little risky to do considering the changes to power. Alright. But I like this. Great change. I still don't know why Wing Shard increases movement speed in the first... Well, okay, I do know why. Never mind. I don't think that that's an important change there, though. Not really... I'm going to be really honest. I don't see the duration change being a really significant factor. This is where they mention that they're bringing the percentage penetration back. I've already mentioned that. Nerfs to individual gods. Movement speed nerf on Aphrodite. I think this is a good thing. She's too hard to pin down. She was too hard to pin down with the movement speed as it was before. I think this is a bit more manageable, more reasonable. I have no problem with that. I've never noticed a particular issue with the Eagle Eye damage, personally. Maybe that's my own experience. I don't have a problem with this, though. I don't think it's going to change him substantially enough. This is fine. Totally okay with that. Same problem as Aphrodite. I don't think he needed this. Alright, gonna be really honest. Well, let me rephrase that. I don't think he needed the defense stance nerf. I think the physical power nerf is justified. I think he hit a little too hard. I don't think the defensive stance needed a change. Again, that might just be my experiences with him. This needed to happen. It really did. Totally fine with this. He was way too strong with that ult. This, not really a big deal. Although it did make it impossible to catch up to her. I don't think that that's a significant enough change to prevent that from happening, but that's just me. This is a smart change. I already talked about how reducing the total HP you're getting from items is going to change executes. This is a good change. They don't really repeat it for anyone else, though. But the difference with Achilles, very specifically, is that he can theoretically execute an entire enemy team and get a pentakill. On paper. So I can understand why they changed his and nobody else's, but mark my words, executes are going to get scarier. This needed to happen. It really did. I'm not sure the slow was needed. I don't think it makes a big difference here. Mez duration, I'm okay with. It only really matters when you're trying to run away from an enemy. If you're trying to actively fight someone, Serenade's Mesmerize isn't making a big difference. Or at least the duration of it, because you're going to be shooting him right afterwards. It only makes a difference when you're running away, which is very likely why they also buffed the moves, at least in terms of its move speed. Alright, essentially, the problem with Apollo is, if you're not ulting, you're probably not going to escape with the Serenade moves combo, because it wasn't enough. So, theoretically, with these buffs, Apollo has a slightly better escape option. This is fine. I think this is a good... I like the increase in the power scaling. I'm not sure the cooldown buff was needed. It'll be interesting to see with that. But I think the cooldown was a little too much. I do really like this, though. Belch the Gods. Yeah, I can see that would be really important for him. That's fine. I like the increase to cat hit points. I think that's good. This isn't really that big of a deal, because a lot of the times when you were using training exercise to cleanse CC, it was to cleanse CC that had already happened, rather than prevent CC from happening in the future. Really not a big difference. This needed to happen. The cooldown on entering walls, it took too long. That's fine. I do like the decreased damage taken while in a wall, also good. She took damage too fast in walls. That's good. This is interesting. I'll be interested to see if this... I don't think this was necessary. Danzaburou already hit like a steam train. I'm guessing that they did this because the power went down, but I don't think that's going to affect Danzaburou that much. I don't know if this was necessary. Strife, yeah, that's fine. I can understand that. This is fine. Again, we're talking about decreased max health, so we need to increase the percentage of max health that damage that is done. I'm totally cool with this. Slight increase in her duration doesn't make a difference. Increased mitigation is important because we have decreased health and protections from items, so that becomes necessary buffing this. Totally cool with that. Sure. I can see that. Wing Gust was, yeah, a little on the weak side. I can see that. Bring back nice strong Fafnir, like that. Shield duration, I'm okay with. That's fine. Base damage increase on Cataclysm, fine. I don't think Ricochet needed a base damage increase personally, but maybe that's just me. Great End did need the buff. I don't like Ixchel where she is, but that's not from her ult. Alright, her ult damage was a little weak. This is a very, very slight buff. I'm fine with this. I know a lot of people might not be. I do want to see some of her other stuff get nerfed a little bit more. But that mild buff to her ult is fine. Penetration through space and time is just brought back to where it was before to match the penetration changes. That's fine. Slipstream needed better cooldowns. Totally fine with that. Shell Spikes needed this damage again. That's fine. Damage mitigation on this. That's fine. Non-conquest buffs have been removed from Kuzenbo. Amen. Increased movement speed and basic attack reduction per stack. Amazing. Because, quite honestly, stacking that takes forever, so I like that. Piercing Thrust needed the buff. It's too weak. It was too weak. That's nice. Agonizing Visions debuff being increased. Great for Loki. Totally fine. Flurry base damage. Nice, but yeah, I can see them reverting that. That's fine. This is fine. This is fine. No, I'm cool with that. Played her earlier today. She feels good. I don't think Mulan needed these buffs. Alright, I'll amend that statement. Grapple, I'm fine with. I think Spear Thrust didn't need it. I think they keep on going in this direction. We're going to have OP Mulan again. I love the change to Trident, though. This increase in attack speed, yes. I've stated for a while that attack speed Poseidon is scarier than a lot of people give it credit for. Finally, we can dominate as a broken attack speed Poseidon. All hail attack speed Poseidon. Anyways, rant over. Anyways, looking here, nope, I'm totally fine with that. We've had increase, we've decreased the protections and power across items across the board, so buffing Solar Blessing, totally understandable. Yes, this needed to happen. Alright. Increased damage per tick on the initial target, the one that had the Raiju. Totally fine with this. They should be taking extra damage for being the initial problem. I don't have any issue with that. I think this is too extreme. I like the decrease to 10-hand Shadow Fist's cooldown. I like that. I don't think his passive health shield needed the buff. Given that we already have a decreased cooldown of 10-hand Shadow Fist, I think this was a bit extreme. If they did want to buff it, I think 8% would have been a better amount. I think 9% is a bit too heavy on this. I think we're going to have a really hard time killing Ravon. I am aware of the fact that they did this change because, oh, less HP, so the health shield needs to be buffed. I understand that. I understand why. I just think it's too much. I think 9% is too much. I think 8% would have been better. Remember, you can stack 3 of these. Okay? Something a lot of people forget. You can have 3 of these health shields kicking around. You've gone from a 21 plus 21 for 42 plus another one for 63% all the way up to a deeply unholy, for Pete's sakes, why am I having a math brain cramp here? 81%. Why I couldn't math that out in my head, I don't know. 81% of his max health across 3 separate shields. No. I think that's too much, in my opinion. 8% would have been a better number to run on this. I have no problem with this. He needed the buff. This is fine. His ult is a little underwhelming. It needed a bit of an adjustment. The initial hit of the snowstorm gets additional power scaling. That's fine. Decreased cooldowns on Sobek. That's fine. The reason why that's fine is because if he misses, he's totally dead. This needed to be adjusted in view of the HP changes to items. Totally understandable. I don't think he needed this, but okay. I like the more significant attack speed. I'm sorry, I won't even say attack speed. I like the passive change because it actually makes it a bit more strategic, whether you're running the bow or the axes. I like that. Inferno Cannon, I don't think needed this. I'm going to be really honest. There's always going to be an Inferno Cannon on the field. There's going to be no period of time in which there isn't a cannon shooting you in the face unless you immediately stop attacking Vulcan and destroy that cannon. I don't like this. I don't like this. I think this is a bit much. People are going to be really sick of cannons. The duration of the route needed to change. It needed to be increased. That's fine. Finally bringing back Strong Zong. Love that. Again, this is in view of the reduction of protections from items. They needed to adjust that, of course. But that is a general overview of the update. And I wanted to talk about it because there's a lot of things going on here. And again, I'm still technically not done because I didn't talk about Conquest. I will make a separate video on that because the map itself has changed, so that does require its own separate video. But with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.